It's April, which means it's Sexual Assault Awareness Month. This year's theme is Building Connected Communities. Sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thanks so much for joining me. So, every year, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center develops the theme for the year. And this year, it's about basically trying to build communities in which it's less likely that sexual abuse, assault, and harassment will continue to happen. Also sounds maybe a little familiar. So I'm doing this video today just to kind of acknowledge, first of all, that it is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Some years I'm a little bit more involved in talking about it than others. But this year, as I thought about it, I've noticed that there's a particular theme that keeps coming up as I think about it. And if you've watched many of my videos, you probably have a good sense, maybe have it narrowed down to what a few of those might be. Shame. Shame is what I continue to find myself thinking about as I think about raising awareness around sexual assault. And I know that I think about shame a lot. I talk about shame a lot, but there's a reason for that. It's not necessarily that I just love talking about shame. It is something that impacts every single one of us who have experienced sexual trauma. Now, you may not be aware that it's affected you, that you feel or experience shame. And maybe you don't at this particular time, but I feel really confident in saying that while it may look different for different people, shame is kind of an inherent part of the experience of sexual trauma, sexual violence, sexual assault, sexual abuse, even sexual harassment. People can often feel a lot of shame around. And there are a lot of things that we can do as members of every community to try to foster communities in which we reduce the likelihood. And there are people working in a lot of different capacities to help do that. But as individuals, what can we do? Well, as I say all the time, I really believe that one of the most important things that we can do is to talk about it. Now, I'm going to get into a couple of different things here, so it's not necessarily going to be the same video you've heard me do before. But whether we're talking about just pure prevention in whatever capacity that looks like, from whatever angle we might be talking about, or we're talking about, well, it's all, I guess, around prevention, or we're talking about healing. All of it requires conversations. So with prevention, now prevention is not my area of expertise necessarily, but my first kind of place that I worked at in this role was called the Center for Prevention of Abuse. So while my expertise is not necessarily in like prevention education, I am fully aware that there are a lot of things that go into prevention. And so much of that is around education. Now, I'm not talking about formal education, though that can certainly play a role. I'm talking about just people having an understanding. And so when we do talk about prevention education, oftentimes there are people tasked with going into different types of organizations and talking about the prevalence and things to be on the lookout for and ways to, in a sense, kind of foster different kinds of things within our children and in our classrooms and in our justice system, all kinds of things, because it really is very far reaching. If you think about all the different things that can happen when somebody experiences a sexual trauma, and let's just think about children for now. First of all, children still, for the most part, don't tell. And that obviously creates a whole lot of circumstances and situations that are really difficult for that person. But talking about what happens if that person does tell. So first, if they do tell, they have to be believed, right? And whether they tell a parent or some other person who's charged with their caregiving at some point, somebody within their school system, a friend. Now, as a young child, a friend wouldn't likely have any more education or understanding around it than they do. But let's assume we're talking about an adult. There are things that that adult needs to be aware of. They need to be educated on. They need to have an understanding of, in order to respond in a way that helps that person, helps that child get the support that they need, go through the process in the way that is most beneficial to them, and hopefully get the resources they need on the other side of that. And there's a whole lot that goes into those resources, right? There's a justice system. There's probably going to be, especially with a child, there's likely going to be some aspect of a medical system involved. There's potentially going to be child protective services involved. So there are a lot of different organizations, systems that end up playing a role if that child is believed. Now, obviously, if that child is not believed, that creates a whole other sort of circumstances, and those are the kinds of things I typically tend to talk about. But even just in that one example I gave, those systems are big systems. There are a lot of kind of moving parts, so to speak, within those systems. And all of the people that are part of that system who have any role whatsoever need to have the education, the understanding, the training. And not only do they need to have it, they need to believe in it. And that part can sometimes be just as challenging. And what I mean by believe in it, and this is where people having conversations is really, really important. There are people who maybe work in a different sort of system. So even somebody like in a medical system, certainly, probably, hopefully not as likely in child protective services, but also within the justice system. There are people who would definitely view themselves as somebody who doesn't think it should happen, thinks people who do it are terrible, whatever. But when they are faced with the situation, as I talked about in terms of like disclosure and self-protection and that sort of thing, they can sometimes, because of their own stuff, find themselves responding to the situation differently when faced with a reality than they might think on a cognitive level. So all of that really plays a role. Now, there are, as I said, there are people whose roles professionally are to educate and train and that sort of thing. But so often within our communities, whether that is our small group of friends, our neighborhood association, our local police department, our schools, how people really begin to understand. So not just know the facts, but really deeply understand, is by hearing people share their stories, by having people who have experienced it share with them what they've thought at the time, how they blame themselves, or the struggles that they've had. All of that is how people shift what they actually feel about this. People can know something, but if somebody is talking about it in a more personal way with them, they can often end up feeling kind of uncomfortable. Now, that could mean different things, but uncomfortable on some level. And when that happens, we tend to disconnect a little bit. So maybe we're not really taking in what the person is saying. We start having our own thoughts to counteract what they're saying to make us feel a little bit better. But the more that people hear things, the more people hear things that are very similar to other things that they've heard, the more it really begins to internalize. And that is when shifts begin to happen. Shifts in our communities and certainly in our society takes time. Sometimes a lot of time. And it can feel frustrating, disempowering, sometimes even hopeless, depending on your community, in things really being able to change. In this particular circumstance, for survivors to be believed. As I'm recording this, there's just been recently in the last few days, apparently, a lot of women just randomly being punched in the face in New York City. And apparently, they're sharing that on social media, and there are people saying that they don't believe them. Now, yes, that's not about sexual assault specifically, but when it comes to interpersonal violence across the board, we tend to, as a society, we tend to have difficulty hearing it, accepting it. We blame the victim quite often, even if we don't come out and say, it's your fault. Well, why were you on your phone? Why weren't you paying attention? Why didn't you call the police? Like so many things with that circumstance in New York City right now. And the same thing happens, and I talked about this recently with disclosing, right? Where people sometimes genuinely are interested in understanding, but the questions themselves can be, or at least experienced as being blamed. And that's across the board, really in every community, in virtually every family, probably virtually in every friend group, there's going to be somebody that has difficulty with that. Now, I want to be clear that I am not blaming those people. I think that particularly in those different systems that I was referring to, there are people who genuinely care. But because they do not have a real understanding, it can create a circumstance in which that person feels less than supported. And I know that in a lot of these systems, when they're talking amongst themselves, they can talk about things in a way, and I have heard them, they can talk about things in a way that is victim blaming, is a form of denial about the reality of that person's experience or the reality of that type of circumstance generally, minimizing the reality of that. And that's part of what continues to perpetuate the communities and systems in which survivors are not taken seriously, in which survivors are not able to receive the kind of support that they deserve in whatever system we might be talking about. Thinking about, like, one of the things that here in the US, that is really very significant over these last, I don't remember how long it's been at this point, a few years or so. But abortion not being accessible for people that are sexually assaulted and impregnated as a result of that, no matter who the perpetrator is, and being forced, children being forced to carry that baby to term. That comes from victim blaming. It comes from not understanding the reality of what that means. How do we change that? Any of it. We change it by conversations. And I know you're probably tired of hearing me say this, but this is exactly why I talk about it, because I know that nobody watching this takes abuse lightly. Nobody watching this thinks it's not a big deal. There's a very strong likelihood that by far the majority of people watching this, probably 99% of people at least, have experienced it to some degree or another. We change it. We build those connected communities by talking about it. We change systems. We change how we think about perpetrators, survivors. We think about resilience differently. Everything that has shifted over history in terms of how we view it has happened through understanding. And that understanding, much of the time, some of it comes from research and science, but much of it comes from talking about it, talking about the reality of it. And even the stuff around science, if nobody talked about it, if it was just written in some medical journal somewhere, it wouldn't change anything. We have to talk about it. People, regular, everyday people, have to be able to understand it. And of course, that is also how we stop shaming survivors. It's how we, as survivors, stop taking on the shame of other people's behavior. I even heard a person who was punched in the face in New York City talk about feeling embarrassed. And I just thought, why would you feel embarrassed? Of course it hurt. Of course you're upset. You didn't do anything. And I've heard many of them talk about, I don't know how many videos I've seen, probably maybe 10 different ones. And I would say the majority of them talking about, on some level, feeling that they need to justify why they weren't paying attention to everybody around them. You should be able to walk down the street without fear of being punched. You should be able to walk down the street without worrying about somebody assaulting you in whatever capacity that might be. You deserve to be able to be in your work environment and not worry about somebody holding something over your head if you don't respond in exactly the right way, keeping you from getting a promotion, making your work life harder. You should absolutely be able to feel free in your own family and not worry about when the next time is going to be. You absolutely should not be carrying the shame that doesn't belong to you. We deserve better. We as survivors deserve better. Our children, and when I say our children, I'm talking about collectively, our children deserve better. Their children might actually have the opportunity to experience better if we are able to talk about it, if we are able to build those connected communities. And that starts one-on-one, and then maybe it expands to 3, to 4. And it does expand because that one person that you might talk to is going to talk to somebody else. And then that person is going to talk to somebody else. It's not going to change by one conversation. But the more that we are willing to have conversations, ask questions, the less shame there will be, the more understanding we'll have. And that is what shifts what we believe, how we feel, how we show up, and how we change the systems that have caused us as survivors to continue to feel the shame that we do. So, think about how can you begin that shift within your community. It starts with you, your own internal dialogue. Noticing how you're speaking to yourself, how you're blaming yourself. When that shame shows up, what kind of responsibility are you taking for what happened? Whether it's the experience itself of trauma or the effect that it's had on you, the struggle it's created. That's where a lot of the shame continues to be reinforced over and again. So it starts there, noticing that. Maybe you have a conversation with a friend or a family member or a colleague. Maybe you share something on your social media. It doesn't have to be your personal experience. Maybe it's just an acknowledgement that it's Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Most people actually do not know that April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. It's not typically something that is really widely publicized, in part because people don't want to hear it. And we really need to shift that. And there are some amazing organizations and people doing some incredible work out there to do that. But we need to be a part of that too. But we can do it together. I want us to do it together. Like I imagine us all standing in just arm in arm together, just kind of standing there, and for ourselves and for every other survivor that already exists, and unfortunately those still to come. When I say together we heal, this is also part of what I mean. Because not only can we not heal on our own, but the more that we talk about this, and again, it could be one-on-one. It doesn't have to be publicly. The more we heal, the less shame we hold on to. We are survivors, and that is something that we can feel proud of. Even if our life is not what we want it to be, even if it's incredibly messy, even when there's a lot of struggle, who survived. And if you experienced childhood trauma and you didn't tell or you weren't believed, you survived that on your own. Think about that. The strength, the resilience that exists within you. And that is something to feel proud of. That is what makes you a survivor. And as a survivor, I join with you. Together, we can end the shame. And as we end this shame, we build stronger, connected communities. I'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments. Thank you so much for watching and being a part of this incredible community. If you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe, click the bell for notifications. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.